My name is Reema Patel. I'm Associate Director for Engagements at the Ada Lovelace Institute, and this is part of our broad series of public events on the DCMS consultation, which has been recently announced by the government. And the purpose of today, this particular event, is about inviting a discussion around the notion of fairness as set out in the consultation, and we've got some excellent speakers who will introduce themselves very quickly and respond to this very important question and context. Just a few housekeeping notes. The first is that we do have live subtitles that are available. You just press CC live transcript to see the subtitle, and also just a few points. Obviously, if we have any technical difficulties or challenges, we'll invite speakers to turn their videos off and intervene and hopefully make things as seamless and as straightforward as possible. But thank you so much for joining us. In terms of the background and context, of course, there's a lot around fairness that's been discussed in the academic literature, but also elsewhere. There's been an interrogation of what fairness actually means in practice in context, and this conversation is happening in a wider context. So you've got the UK context, where the UK government has articulated an agenda to level up around broader social inequalities and health inequalities. But there's also the European context, which is that we are seeing draft regulations in the EU AI framework, for instance, that touch on elements of understanding how to tackle bias and mitigate bias. So we'll come on to a discussion about that. But without any further ado, I'm going to turn to Agathe and Seda, who will briefly introduce themselves. And then I will also ask Agathe and Seda to respond to an initial provocation, which everyone will weigh in on, which is this question, which is how should we think about and conceptualize fairness? Is the way it's set out in the consultation the right way, or do you think that there are other approaches that could be best taken? So over to you, Agathe and Seda, for 3 minutes, and then we will move to Damian, who will introduce himself, to Sandra, who will then introduce herself, and then to Renee. So you all have a chance to weigh in on this question, and then we'll go into some of the more detailed bits and pieces around legislation itself, definition, around bias mitigation and the practical intervention, and some of those points. So over to you, Agathe and Seda.
I'll just do a quick introduction and then give the word to Agathe, who will be presenting for us. I'm Seda Gürses. I'm Associate Professor at Technical University of Delft, that's in the Netherlands. And we just published a report together with Agathe for EDRI called Beyond Debiasing, Addressing the Inequalities of AI. And I'm also a member of the Institute for Technology in the Public Interest. So with that, Agathe, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So, hi, I'm Agathe, a PhD student in computer science in TU Delft in the Netherlands. And yeah, I co-authored with Seda the report. We wrote this report in response to a request from EDRI, which was to evaluate whether debiasing is a necessary and sufficient response to AI harms, as suggested in various AI regulatory initiatives in the EU. And overall, we believe a focus on algorithms, data, and bias is insufficient and misplaced, given the breadth of harms from the introduction of AI. So, for instance, the production of AI systems continues to create bad labor conditions and environmental harms. Further, the computational dependencies created by AI concentrate power in the hands of a few tech companies, meaning that when organizations or individuals decide to adopt AI, they are already subject to a considerable power asymmetry. And framed this way, debiasing further empowers companies to bypass such greater concerns by reducing inequalities to algorithmic outputs and declaring these results through limited notions of fairness, which are applied at the discretion of these companies. And so to understand this, it's useful to step back and analyze the conceptualization of AI unfairness as data or algorithmic bias, as it is typically done in computer science. So debiasing consists in first deciding on two groups of inner populations, through which unfairness might manifest. And then the idea is that if we can establish parity for a select measure between these two groups, then the AI system would be fair and otherwise not. And while this can be useful for identifying blunt forms of inequality in the outputs of the systems, these simplistic metrics cannot appropriately reflect the complexity of inequality in the world. So conceptually, for instance, they imply the fact that parity between the two groups is already desired, which is not necessarily the case. And the focus of on the metrics further erase other issues, like how the way one sets up a machine learning model, which might be questionable and in certain cases also undesirable. So for instance, do we really want to provide the possibility to predict one's ethnicity through facial recognition systems? Now we're really aware that debiasing for ethnic minorities can lead to over-surveillance of those minorities. So in summary, the computer science formalization of these issues is limited and can in itself also cause more harms. Moreover, it is also technically challenging to apply since the development process of AI is complex. So yeah, in the report overall, we recommend to use debiasing only as a preliminary filter for evaluating AI systems. And that would be as a part of a more holistic and independent auditing process. And finally, we notice this event is framed as a fair use of data, but in the context of AI, we should not narrow ourselves to data, but also how the complex design and production of AI systems, so their introduction into organizations may cause greater harms.
Thank you very much. And Damian, over to you. Would you be able to briefly introduce yourself and also reflect on that opening provocation around how we should think about fairness? Is that even the right concept to use?
Yeah, well, hello, my name is Damian Clifford. I'm a senior lecturer at the Australian National University, so in Canberra. So it's quite late for me, so if I'm not particularly responsive, that's the reason why. But yeah, so I mean, I am, I suppose, predominantly a lot of my research focuses on data privacy, where fairness is really positioned as a core principle, certainly within the EU framework. So I think it's extremely difficult to discuss these topics without addressing fairness. Now, I think, as Agathe kind of pointed to, there's an awful lot of, obviously, computer science literature discussing fairness and a particular conceptualization of what fairness means. So there's definitely room for discussion of an intersection between those literatures and what fairness means in the data protection or data privacy context. Outside of that, I think, you know, there's broader notions of fairness or narrower notions of fairness, depending on the way you want to look at it, within other areas of law that are also very relevant, I suppose. That kind of gets to some of the consultation report in itself. So the intersection between different areas of law, which we might discuss in a bit. But for instance, one might be in consumer law, where there's a notion of unfairness, for instance. So I think fairness is definitely one of the appropriate lenses through which to kind of discuss these problems. And I think if you're discussing any kind of reform of data privacy legislation, data protection legislation, then you have to refer to the importance and core role for what is the fairness principle. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Sandra, over to you. I think you're next, which is around your thoughts on this question, and feel very free to express, you know, different views and opinions. I think that's the objective of this discussion, is to surface as many pluralities of perspectives as possible. And then we'll come to Renee and then dive into some of the more detailed areas of the consultation.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I'm Sandra Wachter. I'm associate professor at the University of Oxford at the Oxford Internet Institute. I'm a lawyer by background, and I focus on the legal and ethical implications of emerging technologies. I think the question that you've raised is really, really important, because I don't think we can talk about AI without talking about bias. I think those topics are closely married and ought not to be divorced. And I'm very happy to see that actually everybody has a growing conscience of that particular problem. And you can see that a lot of people are starting to think about bias detection tools and bias mitigation tools. In my research, what I have done recently is to try to look at those fairness and bias tests that are out there and assess whether they are fit for purpose. And the way that I did that is actually going a step back rather than looking at the technical tool in detail. I asked as a lawyer the question, like, what do we actually understand as fairness and equity and equality and equal opportunity in legal terms? So what I did is I looked actually at equality law in the UK and the European Union, the member states, and tried to figure out what the courts and the scholarship and the case law actually think is fair and how to measure it, how to detect it, how to remedy it. And what we did then is we tried to look at the fairness tests, bias tests that are currently out there. And in a paper that we published recently, which is called Bias Preservation in Machine Learning and the Legality of Fairness Metrics under European Non-Discrimination Law, the conclusion that we arrived at, that out of 20 fairness tests that are out there, 13 do not live up to the standards of European equality law. They fail. So the majority of them does not live up to it. One of the reasons is probably because many of those have been developed in the US, where the idea of fairness and equity and equality is just fundamentally different to how it is in the UK and in Europe. But I think that's very important, that finding, because it just shows that choosing a fairness metrics is not a neutral act at all. And we tried to come up with a category to show what the underlying assumptions of those fairness metrics are, because they're not neutral. So we categorize them in bias preserving and bias transforming. In a very simple manner, one batch of those fairness metrics say, you are not being unfair as long as you're not making things worse. And the other batch only says, you are being fair if the outcome is equal across groups. So one set of fairness tests, right, is saying it is okay to freeze the status quo, keep inequalities as they are, as long as you're not making things worse. And the other one, the more aspiring notion, is, well, you know, fairness is only truly achieved if you have equality in results. The interesting thing is that in Europe, we believe in substantive equality, right? So the idea is really not just about equal treatment, which is a given, but actually think about whether the results are really treating everybody equally, if we're actually achieving equity and real equal opportunity, de facto equality, basically. But the majority of the fairness tests don't do that. They just freeze the status quo rather than making things better. And that is really, really problematic, because it shows that you might have the best intentions of being somebody that wants to mitigate and prevent biases, but actually you're just locking things in as they are. However, there are some fairness tests that work in a European setting. My co-authors, Brent Middlestad and Chris Russell, we also tried to create our own bias fairness test that would live up to those European standards in a paper that is called Why Fairness Cannot Be Automated. And I'm going to talk about that at length later, because that's also something that we need to come to grips with, that fairness cannot be automated, nor should it be, because fairness is contextual and depends on a case-to-case assessment. However, we came up with an idea of a way to try to come up with a tool that helps people to find certain types of disparities in a data set and then make the right judgment call according to the European standards that we have. And the test that we have developed is, has been positively received. Recently, Amazon, for example, came across our work. A team of researchers found that quite interesting, and they have now implemented it in their own services. So it's very exciting to see that people working on the ground find the work also useful, but anybody who is interested in the topic can access the code and the data and everything, because it's open access, open code. So anybody interested in that particular test or the research that we have done can have a look at it fully for free.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn to Renee and ask for a transatlantic perspective. So Renee, please introduce yourself, the work and research you're doing, and the sort of inevitable kind of equality, equity debate discussion. I think from your perspective, it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts about fairness, yes, but also equity, equality. And let's think about how we bring those concepts into the conversation. So over to you, Renee.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and including me in the conversation. So, I spend a lot of time thinking about fairness because my work is at the intersection of criminal justice and AI. And as a criminologist and criminal psychologist, all of the work that I've been doing over the last 2 years, the work has been looking at the ways in which we deploy algorithms on the streets within the criminal justice system and policing, in police investigations, as well as the ways in which communities are being impacted by the ways in which we're using algorithms. So for me, it's fairness, and it's also algorithmic injustices that continue to undermine the maturity of AI. So algorithmic injustice within the context of fairness are really concepts that I've been thinking about and playing with and really speaking about, and also looking through my work as a data activist at the ways in which algorithms are really changing the legacies and the trajectories of different groups, looking at how Black, Indigenous people of color are being impacted by these long-term impacts of data on society, and the ways in which we're using data to create algorithms and then deploy these algorithms as part of our AI systems. So as a data activist, I think I spend even more time thinking about fairness because I'm looking at inequities, inequalities, and I'm also looking at the ways in which data in particular is transmitting the transmission of intergenerational harm in communities because of algorithms. So concepts such as data trauma and data discrimination and data profiling, data marginalization, even data victimization are also really critical when we're thinking about fairness and we're thinking about algorithmic injustices. So the problematic use of data, the lack of representation and respect for diversity, equity, and inclusion, bringing a justice-informed perspective and a trauma-informed perspective when we are thinking about data and when we are thinking about algorithms. I think we can all agree that there's a wealth of evidence out there that shows those long-term impacts of AI systems and how they replicate historical and, of course, contemporary conditions of injustice, and rather than alleviating them. So for me, I really advocate about this justice-oriented and trauma-informed approach. If we want to start to think about fairness, we've got to think about those impacts on underserved, high needs, and under-resourced communities. And we've also got to rethink words like experts when we are thinking about how we are going to really respect data rights and knowledge production, and how we're going to really include as many voices as we can in this conversation about fairness, about AI, about data, and about how we build digital futures and how we ensure we bring equity into the production, not only of data, but in the production of the legacies that we will soon have. So that's my work in a nutshell.
Thank you. And that's been a wonderful introduction from all of you around areas of your thinking that you're doing, obviously quite wide ranging. I'm going to turn now to Agathe and obviously ask you to build off some of what you've heard. How do you think we could reconceptualize fairness and think about engaging with the UK government, DCMS, just building off what you've just heard from peers and colleagues, but also very much your own research as well. And you've got 3 minutes really to reflect on that, and then I will turn to others on this panel to reflect on different areas of the DCMS consultation. Thank you, Renee.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, so I think from what I heard, everybody agrees that there is, well, something interesting looking into fairness of data or the outputs of the algorithms, but that is, yeah, not enough, let's say. So I think, for instance, Sandra talked about bias preserving or bias transforming metrics, which is, I think, one of the aspects of fairness or bias. Metrics are the biasing methods that is interesting to look at because, well, a lot of these methods can show some form of inequality, but they won't really be useful or enough to actually change the structural problems which are behind, which is one of the limitations of the, well, of this bias framing. And I think there are also a lot of other bias, well, limitations that that I briefly mentioned beforehand, that probably, well, yeah, can't be tackled just by looking into the data or algorithm frame. So for instance, well, simply technically, all these metrics or mitigation methods are still hard to apply in practice. Well, just because there are statistical limitations, but also because the development process of an AI system is very complex with, well, a lot of different pipelines which are interdependent and people working on these pipelines. So, well, it's hard to set a standard process or guidance to actually apply the metrics or the mitigation methods. But even if we could, then conceptually as well, there are a lot of limitations. So, for instance, it might not be enough to actually look into the outputs of the algorithm, but we should probably look more into the outcomes. So what people make of these outputs, and just measuring a certain metric in the outputs won't actually represent what people did with these outputs. We can think of, I don't know, a lawyer who would want to make a decision based on, the recommendation from an AI output. Well, they might not follow these outputs, and then the fairness metric wouldn't be enough. Then, these metrics also erase broader externalities, so they focus on only the data subjects, so subjects of these outputs, but not on other people who might also be impacted and are not directly subject of these decisions. And I think Sandra also mentioned, for instance, that all this research is very US-centric until now, and we don't actually know how this would apply to inequality issues in Europe, for instance.
Thank you. And I'm just going to quickly ask Seda, who I think indicated that she'd like to weigh in on this, and then turn to Damian.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'm going to try to channel Damian in a little bit, because if we look at where fairness came from, it was really the tech industry's kind of own solution to bypass data protection in some way. I mean, we can kind of see that as a provocative take on what they've done, which is that in the US, the policy making from industry was to separate data collection from data processing, and to say we can't control data collection and we should focus on data processing. And if we look at processing, we have bias. So in order to bypass that, we have to collect more sensitive data. So let's weaken those collection rules so that we can actually process fairly. So if we think about it that way, then it really is debiasing and fairness was really both giving the companies the discretion to decide how they're going to deal with inequalities by reducing them to algorithmic outputs, and at the same time bypassing data protection laws. And you can see the consequences of that in current EU proposals, where they're basically putting holes into data protection, saying you can access sensitive data if it is for the reason of applying fairness frameworks. And I think we should be really worried about, and this is where the communities come in, and Renee's point is very helpful. Communities within Europe have been really split about whether sensitive data should be used for auditing, not for making the systems, but for auditing systems like policing and housing and related decision-making systems. And what we're doing right now is taking a very technocratic approach to discrimination based on just law and what has been pushed by tech companies to say we should use sensitive data to evaluate these systems while increasing surveillance on communities. So I think there's really a hard knot here that if we want to cut out, we have to involve the communities and see what their needs are and how they're being affected by these systems, and be absolutely push against the use of sensitive data, and be very worried about fairness being applied by industry, automated or not by themselves, but really push for independent audits that go beyond algorithmic evaluation. So that's kind of where I think we should go.
Thank you. What I will do is I will ask Renee to come in later on where we've left it, but conscious of time and making sure that we cover all the points we wanted to cover. And Damian, maybe you might have some reflections on the data protection elements in particular, and how fairness is conceptualized in the governance arrangements and proposals going forward. What are your thoughts on that? Again, 3 minutes for you, and then Sandra, and then we'll revisit this point that Seda and Agathe left off at, which is the US-UK conversation. Damian.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I suppose, like, if we start thinking about what fairness means in data protection, I suppose. And I mean, you know, within the European frameworks to begin with, I suppose, you know, the GDPR notion of fairness. I mean, I suppose broadly speaking, we can see a much broader notion there, yeah, than I suppose as is conceptualized in the notion of fairness in the kind of machine learning research. Now, there's kind of, I suppose, largely speaking, you can see two components to that. There's kind of a more process or procedural aspect of fairness, which is quite tied to transparency. So as another key principle in the data protection framework. But there's also kind of a substantive notion to fairness. So the requirement to fair balance different rights and interests that are inherent to the framework and what it's there to protect. So I suppose, you know, those two elements, although distinct, essentially overlap and intersect in the application of the framework wherever personal data is processed. And I think that that's kind of the thing to keep in mind. You know, aside from that, I mean, just generally, if we point out, you know, that distinction between a more process and more substantive notion of fairness, that's not particularly unusual in law generally. Yeah? I mean, we have a very similar division within something like the unfair terms regulations that are implemented in UK law, where there's a formal notion or transparency orientated notion of fairness or unfairness in that framework. Also a substantive one that is kind of circled around good faith. So there's kind of a very similar approach in that sense. What's kind of a little bit unique about fairness in data protection law generally, I think, is that it's kind of a positive notion of fairness in that it's not positioned in terms of unfairness. There's kind of a positive obligation on controllers to take into account rights and obligations of data subjects when they are processing information. So, you know, maybe that's a kind of a little bit of a way that I can kind of segue into a little bit more what that notion of fair balancing actually means, because I suppose that's the one that it really comes down to it really at the end of it, you know, so that balancing of rights and interests, of which I suppose, you know, non-discrimination or equality is part of that, but certainly not the sole focus. Yeah, so it becomes far more about all rights and interests that may be at stake where personal data is processed. But you know, within that kind of substantive dimension, and where you're looking at fairness generally, you can, I suppose, explore both ex ante and ex post manifestations of it then across the framework. So in an ex ante sense, you could be looking at some of the conditions for lawful processing, or in an ex post sense, you can see a role for fairness in the exercising of key data subject rights. And I think probably the most apt example in an ex ante sense would probably be the legitimate interest balancing ground, which has gotten some attention, I suppose, within the consultation report around what should change there. Yeah, so there seems to be a push for the populating of certain legitimate interest categories that are deemed to be legitimate in all circumstances, which potentially present some you know, a data protection point generally. Yeah, so a very good example within that is the use of third-party cookies, which I suppose also demonstrates an intersection with the privacy directive, but it is, I suppose, a deliberate and example of fair balancing and the fair balancing discussion. So perhaps that kind of gives a general overview. I mean, I'm happy to get into more specifics, but I'm also conscious of time. So I'll probably leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Sandra, over to you. I wanted to ask you specifically about what you think might be missing from the consultation document, if you've got any thoughts around that, but also draw upon your awareness of other trends that are happening, you know, sort of interesting trends in this space from the EU context, if you could. Do you have any reflections on some of the legal and the ethical issues? And we'll come back to Renee to get Renee's thoughts on this kind of UK-US question of how do we conceptualize fairness, which brings us neatly back to the objective of the session. And then after that, we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So over to you, Sandra.
Yes, I think I mentioned that already, but I think that the key bit missing is that we are not fully there yet, that we not question the underlying assumptions when we think about the fairness tools that are currently out there. And I think that's a big problem. And I think the thing that I think is missing in general is the first question that you have to ask yourself before you walk down a specific route. And that is really, what is it that you expect of technology, right? Do you want technology to do a job quicker, faster, and cheaper than a human? And is that the reason why you deploy those algorithms? Or do you think technology should be used to address systemic inequalities in our life? Should be used to address unequal access, is there to bring communities closer together, to close disparities of whatever kind. And depending on where you stand, that informs the whole discussion that we're currently having. I think we're not very open about what actually the compass is that we're currently following, right? So a lot of the stuff is just good enough because it just does the same thing that a human used to do, rather than thinking about using tech as a starting point to actually make the world a better place. And I think that part is missing. And again, when you choose a fairness metric, you implicitly make that decision. If you use a bias preserving metrics, you're saying, I'm okay with how things are running at the moment. If you're using a bias transforming metrics, you're saying, no, I'm not okay with that, right? And that is really, really important. And therefore, I think more transparency around it is absolutely needed. So in the work that I have been publishing, a thing that I want to see happening is that companies make open the criteria that they use, the conditional variables that they're using, and the bias tests that they are deploying, as well as the results. Because I think we should be able to see that, because what I think everybody agreed here is that there is not a lot of dialogue around that question, actually. We're dancing around the elephant in the room, but we need to address it. And in a way, making your assumptions, your decision criteria is open, and making public how the algorithm is affecting certain communities is something that is essential, so we can start to have a dialogue whether or not this is acceptable, right? Because there might be disparities that we can live with, and there might be disparities we cannot live with. But especially important is to have transparency, so we do understand how those algorithms are actually optimized, and then we can have an informed discussion around it. And I think that's really what I want to see, because I don't want to leave it up to the private sector to come up, or the tech sector to come up with their own fairness definitions, because I think that would be not a very democratic way to go about this. This is something that has to come from a legitimate source, right? But in order to have that discussion, you need transparency first, so the public can, say whether they agree with that or not. And I think that's the key point.
Thank you. So over to you, Renee. I wondered whether you wanted to engage with some observations that were made earlier, but also I thought you might have some of your own reflections on how we might want to conceptualize and think about fairness. A couple of people actually in the chat have asked about whether it requires something that isn't just about automated rule-based machines, but actually is something that requires human wisdom, insight, those sorts of questions. Do you have any reflections on any of that, particularly drawing from your research?
Sure, thank you. And I think what we have seen is that there have been, many attempts and continuous attempts to design technological tools to debias the data. But nonetheless, we're still seeing the biases. We're still seeing the discrimination. We're still seeing the injustice. And I think what we realize is that we have got to be a little more honest in the ways in which we are talking and thinking about technology. The question is, particularly from a US context, how are we expecting fairness in AI when we do not have fairness in society? When we think about the data sets that we're using, and we're thinking about historical context of data collection and data analysis and what we include and what we exclude, then we know looking for fairness in AI is something we're not going to get. We could have as much transparency and accountability and explainability and auditability of this technology as we are seeing. But because of the opacity of AI, then how could we really get transparency? How could we really get explainability when we still don't understand all the elements to deep learning or any of the other types of systems that we are trying to use? So what we are realizing is not only coming up with technological solutions that say we could try to debias and we could make the algorithms more fair. It comes back to the thinking and the intention behind the design of the technology. In the US, when we design technology for the police to deploy on the streets, we're designing technology for Black and brown people, to criminalize Black and brown people, to arrest Black and brown people. We're not designing technology to deploy in white communities. So if we begin from a place of honesty, then we can have a conversation about fairness. Because what we are seeing in the technology is that particular groups continue to be impacted by the unfairness of algorithms or by algorithmic questions that are just not just. So it really is this conversation that we need to have. And I think when I think about it, I think it was within the context of what Ruha Benjamin calls really the design monoculture, and who's doing the design? Who does the design reflect? Who's at the table when we are designing? Is it that we're designing technology that looks like all of us here? Or is it that we're designing technology that only looks like some of us? We've got to pay attention to that. Dr. Sophia Noble, in her book, Algorithms of Oppression, speaks about technological redlining and how kathy defines certain groups and certain communities. And we've seen coded bias, with Joy Bulamwini and Kathy O'Neill, and we have seen the impact of deploying something like facial recognition on the streets, and the fact that when it comes to wrongful arrest of that technology, again, Black and brown men who are being the victims of the deployment or the weaponization of that kind of data. So if we want to think about fairness in AI, and for me, it's a critical question because of the speed and the scale of this technology, we don't really have time for conversation because we're already seeing the long-term impacts of this technology on certain communities. So when I speak about having a trauma-informed and a justice-informed approach to this technology within the context of algorithmic design, ethical design, we've got to, and this is why I think data activism is so critical, because we've got to put that social justice lens on the ways in which technology is being deployed. So I don't think we have time to have all the conversations we need to have, because we are already seeing in certain communities, the long-term impacts are already happening in real time. So this is why I always say an algorithm is not a computational formula. An algorithm is a legacy. And we're deploying legacies unfairly in certain communities, because we can talk as much as we want about, accountability and transparency and explainability and auditability and interoperability, all of those fantastic things. But at the end of the day, data is about power, it is about privilege, and it is about politics. And it's being used in real time to really reimagine how we move forward, but reimagine in ways that are continuously excluding particular groups.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for everyone's important interventions on this topic. I wanted to pick up on a few points. We'll move into Q&A at the moment, but actually wanted to pick up on a few points around actually the questions that really beautifully mirror some of the points that have been made here. There's something really interesting about the impact. So Renee, you picked up on this point about who is impacted and how different groups and perspectives are able to co-design this notion of fairness. It seems a really important question. And then the other element that seems to come up quite a lot is the sort of, instead of focusing on technical bias mitigation measures, shifting the focus away from technical bias mitigation measures towards a focus on fairness as in terms of the data system and the impact on different perspectives and community. Seda, I'm going to come to you and Agathe next to answer that. So is there anything in your research that you found that speaks to this question? And then Renee, I'll ask you to expand a little bit more, maybe with reference to your thinking about the criminal justice system and biometric, there's a couple of things that's quite interesting around biometrics in this consultation. So I'd like to ask you to expand on some of that as well. So over to you, Agathe and Seda.
Or you can go to that if you want.
Okay, so I was taking notes while you were taking the questions, saying the questions. Sorry, could you maybe repeat the question, Reema, for a moment so that I can kind of catch up?
I can basically repeat so it's in the chat. So it comes from Ignatieff and Marion Oswald, who have been circling around this in the chat. And essentially what they're asking is, do we need to shift the focus away from technical bias mitigation measures towards the impact on people? So if so, what does that look like? What does fairness in that context look like?
Got it.
Okay,
right, thank you. I was hoping I could infer from Agathe's answer, but I'm happy to take on the question. Let's look at Amazon's warehouses, right? Like Amazon's warehouses has a lot of algorithms that select workers there and also keep their working to go on efficiently. It turns out, you know, most of Amazon's warehouse workers are of either they're in the US, African-American descent, or people of color. And in Europe, again, either people of color or people with immigration backgrounds. So even if Amazon would make transparent how they optimize their algorithms, either for selecting these people or defining their working conditions, which we know have not been very good working conditions. And even if they made it fair, saying we will also hire people from different backgrounds, we can see that they're basically distributing harmful jobs. They're potentially pushing for laws that deregulate labor protection, and they are basically creating forms of jobs that are basically very, very bad for the communities who otherwise maybe could benefit from better protection, both legally and technically. So here we see very clearly that a company that has optimized itself, its production process, and has a huge growth mandate, which is that Amazon needs to grow, meaning it's not just about selling things, but it becomes a computational infrastructure for many organizations. And in the process, in order to do that, it has to create a lot of dependency from organizations in the world. So if your municipality or if your local shop wants to deploy AI, it's very likely that they're going to depend on the services provided by Amazon, potentially also Microsoft and Google, in a sense, gutting out their internals, both financially and in terms of governance, by virtue of pushing more and more of their operations onto these companies. So yes, I do think we need a much bigger lens. I think the algorithmic lens has benefited the companies. It has definitely diverted attention, as Julia Powles and Helen Nissenbaum have put it, away from the bigger problem that these companies have to grow. They grow by optimizing their own processes in ways that are very detrimental to labor conditions, and produce these systems by working around laws or making sure the laws work to their advantage, and then producing services that create dependencies at the cost of the smaller organizations that want to now deploy AI. So yes, I think we need to take a bigger view. We have to look at both the political and the economic influence of these companies. Their promises to make things cheaper while actually potentially making them richer and giving them more power over smaller countries, smaller organizations. So yes, I think there's a lot to be thought about in terms of AI itself as producing inequalities. And I think that question is really hard and can't be just answered algorithmically. And then thinking about what kind of technology visions we have as we digitalize more and more organizations, especially with COVID-19. So I think both at the global level, asking the inequalities created through these tech companies, so not abstracting them away as AI and algorithms and data, but saying these are the companies doing the work, and coming all the way down to, okay, what is the organization? How is it going to depend on AI? How does it ensure that if it's going to move towards AI and become dependent on Amazon, Microsoft, et cetera, that it also continues to serve the communities that it's supposed to serve? Because if we don't answer those questions, we're just going to be improving the products, giving them some sort of legal legitimacy, and really causing inequalities in the world.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Seda. I'm going to ask Sandra to weigh in on the same question. I know you have views on that. And then Damian, I think I'm going to ask about whether fairness really is a vexed philosophical concept that philosophers have been deliberating on. I think Charles and a few others, Charles Robb and a few others have proposed that. So Damian, what's your thoughts on that? But let's first continue that discussion. So Sandra, why don't you expand on your views on this question?
Yeah, so when I heard the question, people said, should we not just also look at societal bias, not just technical bias? My heart started beating faster, because yes, of course, how could we not? One informs the other. Like, that is one of the frustrating things when you work in that space, that people somehow see it as divorced and not one being the cause of the other, right? So like, we can all agree that there is technical biases and technical fixes that are easier to do. Like, we talked a little bit about a facial recognition software and how it is less accurate on female faces and on faces of people of color, right? That's, you know, in the purest sense, a tech fix that you could do. Well, you just diversify the data. But having a more accurate facial recognition software system is not going to de-bias the people who are deploying those systems, right? So it's not going to take out the bias of the traditional justice system in general. So you think that you solve tech bias, but actually you didn't really, because the underlying problem is still there. And very often when we talk about bias, people immediately jump into technical bias, or the data set is not diverse enough, or there is a design flaw that can be changed. And very, very often the answer is, oh, let's just throw more data at the problem and that will make things better. And the thing that I always think about is that is not always going to do the trick, because it's not about more data, it's about commitment for social change. I like to think about, but the usual example that I use is just, let's think about the race and gender pay gap, right? We have all the data on this, and we can do data collection for the next 20, 30, 60 years, yeah? I still not get a raise, right? It didn't change. Just having more data on inequality is not going to change inequality. What you really need to do is, yes, find the data to identify where the problems lie, but then you need people to actually be willing to march for that, right? And that's the really, really important point when we talk about algorithmic discrimination and fairness, because a lot of times we only think about the tech solution of things, not thinking about the actual underlying social problem that is still unsolved, even if we throw more data at the problem.
Thank you. So just moving on, I wanted to come to Damian. Obviously, we've got some questions there about fairness as a philosophical context. So over to you, Damian. Is it a philosophical concept? Is it quite well defined in the law? Is it somewhere in between and we need to define it? What's your take on that question from a lawyer's perspective?
Yeah. Well, I suppose, like, I mean, I think there's probably people in the audience that are better at answering the philosophical aspects of this. But as to whether, like, you know, it's properly defined in law, it's a fairly loaded question, in that I suppose there are different conceptualizations of fairness depending on the framework that you're looking at. Yeah, so like if you're comparing consumer protection to data protection, you're going to have different notions of fairness that underpin that framework or that are there. So I think, you know, I suppose as to whether fairness is properly defined in law, it's a much broader question when you're looking at specific frameworks, etc. I suppose part of the problem, and I suppose this has been inherent to everything that has kind of been discussed, is the context dependent nature of the principle or the notion, yeah, in the principle as in the data protection framework. And I suppose the general lack of specific guidance as to what it's supposed to mean, practically speaking. And I suppose, you know, whether it's properly defined in law, if we were to narrow that down and look at whether it's properly defined in data protection law, you could say that it isn't defined at all. It's kind of just outlined as one cross-reference in a principle, yeah. So it's just listed in one provision, and then there are some cross references throughout the other places in the GDPR, but there's no specific reference to what it actually means. And that in itself, I suppose, presents some problems, because you have to spend an awful lot of analysis in order to kind of distill it down into different components, and you can use certainly guidance documents and implicitly in judgments in order to figure that out. But it does result in, I suppose, some jumping through hoops in order to figure out practically what it could mean in the context of actually applying the provisions as they exist, essentially, to counter some of the negative aspects of intensive data processing. So from that side, yes, I suppose, you could say that perhaps it could be better defined in law. You could potentially follow a model that is a little bit more similar to other regimes where there's indications or definitions or guiding principles that inform the application of that principle. But I think it's difficult to say whether fairness generally is properly defined in law, because there are so many different mentionings of fairness across different areas of law. So I'm not sure if that's a particularly satisfactory answer to the question, but I think it kind of points at some of the complexity, because we are essentially looking at intersections of huge different policy agendas, because the applications of technology go across everything. So now I suppose data protection presents a kind of a comfortable avenue in which to look at it, because the data is inherent in its, I suppose, a holistic framework in that sense. So it applies in every context. But yeah, I mean, there would be different notions of potentially fairness in different frameworks that you'd have to consider and how they might be defined. And I suppose consumer law is a good example here. So how it's specifically defined there may be different to the notion of fairness that we have in data protection, and how you actually equate those, practically speaking, when you're looking at an application is really where the rubber meets the road, I think, from a legal perspective.
Thank you. I'm going to come to you, Renee. I know a few people who've asked questions have a particular interest in biometrics, and I also have a particular interest in biometrics, having led a lot of research myself on facial recognition technology and deliberative processes, and working in particular through co-design with a range of different perspectives that are disproportionately impacted by biometric technology. So very much informed by that work. So there's another area within these consultation papers that suggests that the government might introduce a code of practice to govern the use of biometric technologies, and I think that to be able to do that, they would have to introduce some form of primary legislation, so that would be really interesting. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts on what such a code of practice might want to consider or look like, mainly deriving from the conversation that you've been having in the US. But I thought it might be worth sort of slightly shifting the focus to that area, not just a fairness question, but actually taking the fairness question and transplanting it into another part of the consultation response. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure, thanks for the question. When we think about biometrics, biometrics are very powerful, and there are some very powerful uses of the technology. Within the context of facial recognition, I know some countries are saying that, yes, it can be used in extreme cases, criminal investigations that really need to be zoomed in at that moment, things like sex trafficking, kidnapping. How do we use, facial recognition in that context? I think in the US, I think we've been burnt by facial recognition because of the wrongful arrests, because of the situations where the technology is simply being deployed in particular communities and against particular communities. What I would like to say when it comes to any code of practice, I think what we've got to think about is how do we bring diverse and inclusive stakeholder engagement into the conversation, and we're not seeing that. We're not seeing that kind of representation from the communities that are being impacted by the technology. I think it's critical for us to get expert knowledge. And when I say expert knowledge, I mean rethinking and reimagining expert, and expert as community practice, expert as community knowledge into that conversation. Because I think it's time for us to start to see communities as key stakeholders when it comes to data management and the knowledge that's being produced by data. But also something that I want to address just a little bit on the fairness question is that it's really the sad thing is that when we think about those who are impacted by algorithmic injustice, there are certain groups that we always see: Black, brown, women, individuals with disabilities. And it's really unfortunate that those who benefit from the bias don't look like those other groups. So it really comes back to the question of us deliberating in a very honest way and having some very open and honest conversations about the history of data collection, about the history of those communities who have not been treated fairly by the data collection and data analysis process, and to have a really open discussion on how things like enslavement and colonization and oppression and imperialism and how these things are still rearing their heads in the kinds of technologies that are being designed and the ways in which we are using data. So for us to even address the question of fairness, we've got to come from a place where we acknowledge those paths if we are to create digital futures that are equitable, diverse, and of course inclusive. And I always say it has got to be justice-oriented as well as trauma-informed, because we are seeing the long-term impacts of data and society, and we are seeing the intergenerational transmission of trauma in particular communities because of data, and because of the fact that data is now our DNA and data is now our destiny. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful note upon which to wrap up this Q&A and this discussion, which is some of the key themes that I've heard through everyone's discussion and talks and reflections around being really context specific, focusing on the impact on people, in particular people who might be disproportionately impacted in different ways, definitions of fairness and clarity around what that actually looks like tangibly, moving away from a focus on the technical infrastructure and system towards that kind of more societal, people-led approach, and also very importantly, which is acknowledging structural inequalities, including racial inequalities or ableism, for instance, in society. Some of those are kind of really interesting thematic things that I feel we've just scratched the surface on. We will definitely be continuing these conversations. So just to say, we're not trying to squeeze everything into 1 hour, but it has been a wonderful talk. I wanted to thank you, the attendees, for listening in and contributing brilliant questions. And I also wanted to thank our excellent speakers. Thank you so much to everyone for their time and their contribution. And just as a way to wrap up, we will of course be recording this event, so this is available online, and so therefore the kind of points around the questions about chat and discussion, etc., will also be available online. Thank you very much, and take care, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.